You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey y'all, Michael here. I want to take a moment to introduce this episode, which is the first of a two-parter on the Lost Colony, a topic we've been asked many times to discuss on the show, more times than either of us can count. We've skulked around the edges of it a few times, and we felt like the moment had come to take on the legend itself, as well as the rapidly developing discoveries being made by multiple ongoing archaeological and historical research efforts. But before we talk about it, I just want to note there are elements of this story that I'm going to get wrong or I'm going to miss. There are things I'm going to leave out. There are things that I'm going to mispronounce. And I think that's pretty unavoidable, especially for this topic. As an example, this episode includes mentions of Croatoan, which is an island that used to exist, and of the Croatan, who were the people who lived on that island. It also references Hatteras, which is the current name for what used to be Croatoan Island and the island north of it before the inlet between them stopped existing. The shifting nature of the geography of the Outer Banks and of the peoples who lived in this area then and in the time since then mean that sometimes this stuff is confusing for me, and it might be confusing for you too. Mostly I'm pointing this out to say that when I get it wrong, it is not out of intentional disrespect for any of the people included in this story. It's just there's a lot to keep track of with this. The Lost Colony is a knot it seems impossible to unravel entirely. There are real experts, real historians and archaeologists and genealogists and all sorts of experts engaged in doing that work. And I've tried to draw on as much of their work as I can for this episode. In fact, one of those people used to live down the street from me, and every so often she'd pack up and head to the coast to do the hard work of literally unearthing hidden history at a secret location on the coast. So if you happen to hear this, Anne, I hope all is well. The truth is, the Lost Colony is probably the best known and the most seemingly endless rabbit hole in the history of the Carolinas. I said to a friend who grew up where these events took place that it feels to me like the Lost Colony is kind of the Kennedy assassination of our region. There are just infinite theories, all these jumbled and self-contradictory facts, and a ton of different takes and theories that people have developed for it over time. And all of those different theories and ideas have sort of self-organized into their own ecology of myth and theory and hearsay and evidence. Trying to pick the truth out of all that is pretty difficult, but I imagine it's rewarding. I've got a metaphor brewing for how researching this reminded me of going panning in the tourist trap gem mines of Appalachia when I was a kid, but some prose is too purple even for me. I'll tell you this though, I spent weeks researching this episode, months even, and eventually said to Charlie, we need to just go ahead and record this episode because if we wait for me to read everything ever written or every theory out there, we'll be waiting until the end of time. And as I record this intro, my notes are 15 pages long and still growing, and we're done with the episode. Of the sources I pulled from, however, I most highly recommend The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke by Andrew Lawler, published in 2018. I got it from my local public library using the Libby app. That's Libby. So special thanks also to public libraries, librarians, and library workers, because without that book in particular, I would have had a lot less to draw from for this episode. There are other sources I used, but that book was especially engaging and well-researched, and it reads like an adventure novel / thriller. And as a writer, I just want to note that libraries pay for the books they make available to you and me. So the more you check out a library book, A, the more you save your money, and B, the more utility the library gets out of the money they spent to buy that book. So you're doing everybody a favor. Now, like I said, this is a two-parter. I'll wind this episode down after Charlie and I reach the end of what we more or less know happened to the Lost Colony from first-hand accounts of various people who had interactions with them, including the first person to go looking for them. Part 2, which will come out a week from today, will include the most prominent theories out there for what happened to the people of the Lost Colony, including some additional information I read after this recording session. Like I said, this is a topic that doesn't have an end. And at the same time, there's an end that seems fairly obvious. I don't exactly know how to square the circle on it other than to say that this is one of the things I love about history and about weird stuff, about spooky stuff, legends, folklore, and about the Carolinas. The more you look into this stuff, the more there is to find. There's just always something new to be surprised by, always something new to learn. And I really appreciate that y'all want to come along on that trip with Charlie and me and learn it with us. So thanks for listening and enjoy.
I didn't have anything funny to say. Hello and welcome to Arcane Carolinas. It's always like just something improv, right? Like it's never planned. And I'm shifting gears so hard mentally right now that you can probably hear them grinding and see the smoke coming out of my ears to be like, all right, it's Arcane Carolinas time.
I understand that big time. We're both having some really challenging days at the moment.
I am your co-host and sitting here to be entertained, having done zero prep. Charlie Mushaw.
That's hilarious. I am your other co-host, Michael G. Williams, having done a lot of prep and thus ready to talk about this. But I am your other co-host, multi-award-winning novelist, Michael G. Williams.
Regale me with tales that people have been asking for since we started, Michael.
I will do so right now. We're going to talk about the Lost Colony, which is, of course, a well-known story in North Carolina. I certainly had it described to me many times in third grade social studies. And I'm assuming that basically everybody who has ever been a third grader in North Carolina has heard this story. I'm not so sure that everybody in South Carolina has heard this story. I don't know. Let's see. And in that spirit, I'm going to give the very high level, reductive, simplified version that I was told by my third grade teacher.
Go for it.
In 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh sent a group of colonists to the Outer Banks of North Carolina to establish the first English colony in the so-called New World. That colony, once established, was the birthplace of the first English child in North America, named Virginia Dare, in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as the Virgin Queen.
Mm-hmm.
Later, however, a resupply mission arrived to find the colony still standing, but totally abandoned. An extensive search failed to reveal the fate of the colonists, and the only clues to their whereabouts or what had happened were the word Croatoan carved into a tree trunk and crow carved into another. So, were the colonists killed in an attack by the nearby Croatan people, or did they go to them for help for some reason and never return? The Croatan people also disappeared, and so the mystery of what happened has endured for over 400 years. That's the version that I was taught as a third grader in North Carolina.
That's the version I got in school with a couple going theories that I don't know if you want to talk about this now or...
We'll get there.
Okay.
So this is the real and slightly more complex story. And it's going to start with the Spanish Empire.
As always.
Spain's empire in the second half of the 16th century was, in one book that I read about this, it was noted that that was actually the first empire that it could be said the sun never set on.
Okay.
It stretched from India east across Southeast Asia, across the Pacific Ocean, both North and South America and Central America between them, across the Atlantic, including the Caribbean and the Azores and all kinds of places, to Spain in Europe. It was a massive geographical feat of polity. They even controlled the former Portuguese Empire because Philip II, the King of Spain, had claimed the crown of Portugal after the King of Portugal died in battle.
That's mine now.
Pretty much. This was a massive empire and a massive global capitalist enterprise. They engaged in resource exploitation and extraction, basically everywhere they founded colonies. They controlled all international trade. And Panama, the narrowest point in Central America, and thus the narrowest strip by land from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, was key to that trade empire. The way that they moved goods from their Asian holdings and their South Asian holdings over to Europe was they would ship them to the west coast of Panama, what's now Panama, and then they would carry them on land to the east coast of what's now Panama, load them on different ships, and then sail them back to Europe.
Okay, that makes sense.
Everybody was curious as to like, could they find their own Panama, basically?
Sure.
Because that was like really key. The way that Spanish ships moved at the time, they moved with the currents, the air and water currents, draw basically a big circular route from Europe south to the Caribbean, over to the east coast of Central America, Florida, what's now Georgia, and then back across the Atlantic to Europe. Spain's chief economic interests in the Americas were sugarcane and precious metals. And, we've talked about those Spanish conquistadors that showed up in Western North Carolina in the 1540s.
It got run out.
They were looking for gold. Instead, they found indigenous peoples who had copper goods and who were perfectly happy to pull one over on them, intimidate them, run them off, attack them, whatever. And the Spanish kind of said, okay, North America may not really be worth it because we're not getting the response from the people that we encountered in South America and Central America. We've just exterminated everybody.
And it's funny to me, we talked about this in another episode, and they didn't have a good reputation. Not that the English settlers had a great reputation, but they had a better reputation. They're like, well, the English give us guns and they smell and they're drunk, but it's whatever. They're not the Spanish. I get the biggest kick out of that. I forget which episode it was where we found some quotes about that like, and the British settlers were considered to be small, smelly, and drunk.
I believe that was the gray man of Pawleys Island.
Okay.
And in part because Pawleys Island and then like Charleston was basically as far north as the Spanish were ever able to successfully, well, as far as they even attempted colonization. What's now Charleston was originally a Spanish settlement.
Charleston.
Yes. They tried to establish something in the Chesapeake Bay, actually, where Jamestown later got established. And that didn't go very well either. Part of their opposition or their hesitancy about the rest of North America was that one of the very first indigenous people that they kidnapped away from North America and took to Spain to show off in Europe told them, oh, yeah, my people are friendly and we have like gold like you wouldn't believe. We're just covered up in gold. And I think that they're probably going to be very amenable to Catholicism. And if you take me back, then I will definitely show you where to find them. And then like basically instantly disappeared and was never seen again. But in the course of getting brought back, he saw what the Spanish did in Central America and was like, no, this is not going to fly. And in fact, there's another indigenous person from North America who led a group of Jesuit monks to what is now Jamestown so that they could establish a colony there, and then immediately led his own people in an attack on them, slaughtered them all, left one child servant alive, and sent him back to warn everybody, like, okay, don't do this again. And after that, the Spanish were just like, okay, we're pretty good. We're only going to really go as far north as Savannah, and we're going to leave it there. In the early 1500s, an explorer named Verrazano, who's now best known for being the first European to sail into New York Harbor, and like we know his name as the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York City, he mapped the east coast of North America, including the Outer Banks, but he mistakenly believed the sound side of the banks was the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, wow. That would mess a lot of people up with false hope.
Yeah. And he drew a map of North America where it looks basically like North America, except you like take a big pizza slice out of the very middle of it. And the crust, the like wide part, is where the West Coast would be. And the tip of it, the first bite, is the Outer Banks. And he believed that if you just sailed through the Outer Banks, you were in the Pacific Ocean and you just had to sail really far past all the rest of the land to get out into the open ocean.
He doesn't even get an A for effort. That's just F. You fail.
So he tried to get some European powers interested in this as an exploitable thing, as an avenue to explore the Pacific. None of them really bit. One of them was Henry VIII. Henry VIII also did not buy it, but he did keep the map that Verrazano sent him. And that map was thus in the royal holdings when Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, later became queen.
He learned that move from the King of Spain. This is mine now.
Yeah, pretty much.
I learned it from watching you, Spain.
A move that they did not learn from Spain is that Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were Protestant monarchs, which the rest of Europe considered heresy. And especially Philip II considered horrible. And he had as a personal vendetta a desire to see Elizabeth removed from the throne and England conquered and returned to Catholicism. So there was a brewing Cold War between England and Spain for decades.
Your slightly different version of the exact same story makes me so mad that I want to kill you.
That's pretty much exactly it. Another factor in it is that in order to basically needle Spain, Elizabeth signed a bunch of trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire to prop them up, as they were also engaged in a Cold War that occasionally turned hot with the Spanish Empire.
Yes.
Saw England as sort of literally going around them through the Mediterranean to keep their worst enemy active.
Proxy battles.
Yeah. Elizabeth comes to power and says, I think that this might be exploitable, and gives a charter to this guy named Gilbert to go explore North America. Well, he immediately dies.
Oh, I'm dead. Almost beat it.
She takes that charter and splits it in two and gives half of the New World, North America, to his brother, this guy named Adrian Gilbert, and tells him, you get everything north of Newfoundland on the eastern coast of Canada.
Don't trip on your brother on the way out.
Yeah, right. Partly because they knew there was really successful fishing there, and in part because they all still believed that there was a Northwest Passage that would take him around North America to the Pacific. So that was kind of believed to be the most profitable part of the charter. And then the other half of it, the part south of Newfoundland to the border of any Christian kingdom, meaning the border of Spain, but she didn't want to name Spain.
Right.
That one she gave to his half-brother, Walter Raleigh, who by that point she had also appointed to a very special role that she had created just for him, which was something between bodyguard and head of royal security.
We should do an episode just on him at some point because he is a ridiculous character.
Oh, he is. Yeah, he totally is. And so she told him, you get the worst part of this. You're not allowed to leave my presence.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't go over there and check it out. And you've got until, this was the 1580s or the 1570s, you've got until 1591 to establish a permanent colony in some portion of your charter, or I get it back.
Like, what is the incentive there? Like, I'd just be like, I'm good. Give it to somebody else. Like, I got a decent job. I'm here. I can't leave anyway. Like, no.
She thought that by doing this, she would be demonstrating to the court how much favor she had for him, but she would also be keeping him on a tight leash.
No. Oh, thanks. No, this sounds like a project I absolutely don't want. Let's give this to somebody else.
If you're ever in a relationship with somebody who like sets you up for failure, that's what this looks like.
Yes.
So
I'm just thinking about a few former work projects.
Yes, totally. In the Susanna Evans episode, I mentioned a guy named Captain Amadas.
Yeah.
Who encountered the Chuan. He's the guy that Raleigh hired. Raleigh hired him and this other captain named Barlow, and he said, you two take two ships, more than two ships really, but you two are the captains of your ships. I'm sending you to the New World, to this colony that we're calling Virginia. You're going to go over there and explore and find specifically exploitable resources. Barlow and Amadis's expedition was more or less purely exploratory. And what they were supposed to look for was, are there like plants, animals, goods, whatever, precious metals, anything over there that you think make it worth going there for a permanent settlement?
Mm-hmm.
Amadis and Barlow went, and they were shown great hospitality by the natives, especially on Roanoke Island, where the Sikatan Indians welcomed them to the island, fed them lavishly for 6 weeks, and told them, like, oh yeah, we've got all kinds of good stuff. Y'all should definitely establish a copper trade with us. And they did that in part because the Sikatans had to trade with inland tribes to get copper.
Mm-hmm.
The economic agreements that they had been forging with those inland tribes kept becoming more and more disadvantageous for the Sikatan.
Mm-hmm.
They kept having to provide more and more of their own goods to get the same amount of copper. And so they looked at it as, well, if we can make any kind of deal with these English people who just showed up with a bunch of copper, then we can use that as leverage to get a better deal with the natives who are inland from us. And so they treated them great and really welcomed them and said, yeah, y'all come on back anytime. That was 1584. And in 1585, on the strength of the accounts that Amadas and Barlow brought back, Elizabeth said, okay, go for it. Let's establish a colony in this region that you're calling Virginia. And this was partly on the basis of how hospitable the natives had been to them.
Well, of course, if you have a good experience, you're going to be like, this is going to be great.
Yeah. And it was partly also because Amadas and Barlow came back with news of two things that they had never seen in England. One is pipes and pipe tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
And one was sassafras.
Okay.
The sassafras tree grows everywhere, basically west of the Mississippi. It is very common in North America. And the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of North America, used it for everything. They used it for topical ointments for injuries. They used it to treat acne. They used it to treat urinary tract infections.
Rub some sassafras on it.
It's pretty much, like literally. They would use the leaves to treat wounds. They would make tea out of it and drink it as like a daily sort of medicinal thing. They used it as a dye. They used it to flavor food. It forms the basis of gumbo. Like it was in every culture in the western part of North America. And it was very important to them. And it was also everywhere. You did not have to farm this stuff. This stuff was just all over the place. Also, it turns out the oil that the sassafras tree produces is a precursor to MDMA. So it probably made you feel really good.
Oh, interesting.
It's really fascinating. And in large quantities, that oil gives people liver damage and cancer.
So kids, if you're listening, we're not encouraging you to go eat sassafras.
No, in fact, we're saying don't do that. And in the 20th century, for a long time, sassafras and sassafras tea and products based on that oil were actually banned by the FDA because they can cause like real toxicity at high enough levels. The levels that were being used for, topical ointments and things like that by the Native American people, they weren't suffering those effects.
Sure.
The second you start turning it into a product that's going to sit on the shelf at Walgreens, you're getting up into levels that are going to probably damage somebody because you tend to overdo stuff like that.
It's like the studies they have with lab rats. I'm using lab rats as a blanket term for lab animals, but they're like, let's see what happens when we inject, this much saccharin or artificial sugar into something. And it's like, oh, wow, this is really bad. But then you do the math and it's just like, I would have to drink 5 gallons of Diet Coke every day to equal the amount that animal was subjected to with adverse effects or what have you. That's just one example.
Totally.
I am not working for Big NutraSweet, by the way. That's just the first thing that came to mind.
That's very accurate, though. That's exactly the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
Raleigh saw the chance to make some money here. And he basically said to Elizabeth, let's fund a military expedition to do more mapping, more searching for resources like this stuff, and let's figure out what's exploitable there. He also sold them a court on the idea that there was probably a lot of silver and gold there.
Sure.
Elizabeth funds a massive military expedition to go establish the first colony in the New World. And they wind up on Roanoke Island. And they basically immediately build a fort. They build a little town. They build like blacksmith shops and everything, planning to have a colony of 400 soldiers and a few scientists and metallurgists and things like that to begin doing like exploration and mapping and resource exploitation. They left England in 1585 in a multi-ship convoy and immediately ran into problems. They lost ships in storms. They lost soldiers. They had to stop and steal from the Spaniards occasionally to survive. They had a ship run aground in Albemarle Sound once they finally managed to limp everybody who was still along on the trip into the Outer Banks. And when they did run a ship aground in Albemarle Sound, that ship was the one that contained all of their provisions. And so they immediately lost all of their food, basically.
Oh, not the hardtack. No.
They lost basically all their gunpowder. They lost all their food. They lost everything, all their grain, you name it.
My salted meats.
Yeah, but like seriously, like all that stuff just like washed out of the ocean. All that stuff is gone. And they realized we only have enough supplies left to have 100 soldiers stay in this colony. So everybody else had to get back on ships. And they said, okay, we'll give it a shot with just these 100 and we'll see if we can get the locals to feed us again.
Hey guys, we're back. You got any more of that good 6 weeks worth of food?
So the Sikatans were like, oh, yay, it's you again. What do you mean you don't have anything again? So whereas the colony was able to like harvest all the oysters they wanted, they very quickly, like within a matter of weeks or months, were down to an all protein diet.
Ugh.
Because all they could do was fish and get oysters and crabs. They started getting sick. Kind of like with scurvy, they weren't able to get any carbohydrates in their diet, and they started suffering all the health effects that you suffer when you have absolutely zero access to anything other than protein.
The gas must have just been horrible.
Oh, it would have been really, really, really horrible.
Need to chew some sassafras and chill that out.
Right. They started having to rely on the native populations for almost all of their food. And the Sikatan, who had been really nice to the English when they were visitors with the potential to ease some of their own diplomatic problems, they didn't like the English so much as permanent neighbors who were constantly needing something.
I mean, that's it, right? It's like, think about that person in your life at some point that you like, they're like, oh, woe is me, I need help. So you help them and you feel good about it. You're like, oh man, that really sucks. So you help them. And then the next week, it's another catastrophe. And then the week after that, it's another catastrophe. And then another catastrophe. And you're like, all right, nobody has this many catastrophes. I feel like you're using me now. Everyone has known that person in some capacity in their life.
Yeah, totally. So they get so frustrated with the English colony that they actually withdraw from Roanoke Island and established a new capital elsewhere on the island.
Wow. They abandoned their spot.
Literally, their plan was, we're just going to leave the island. These people won't know where to find us. They're not going to have anybody to help them, and they're going to die. And then when they're dead, we'll come back and have our island again.
I kind of like that.
Look at it from their perspective. The English were these heavily armed aliens who showed up, started telling them that their religion was wrong, and also had their hand out constantly.
Right. Be like, I'm good. I'm getting what was the alien that annoyed Fred Flintstone all the time? The Great Gazoo.
Yeah.
Hello, dum dum. And whenever he'd show up, they'd be like, ugh, this guy again.
When I was reading about that, one of the things I thought of was, you remember the people who like hoarded toilet paper in April of 2020? They had all of one thing and they thought, I'll use this to get everything I want for everybody else.
Yep.
That's the English colonists. The English colonists showed up with a bunch of weapons and said, I'll use these to get everything I want.
Every tool's a hammer.
Yes. But also, most of the people who came with the colony had done so voluntarily and on the basis they were going to show up and just be like dripping in gold and silver. And it became very apparent immediately that none of that stuff was around. Yeah. And so, again, within weeks or months, they were horribly dissatisfied and wanted out of there. They were just like, this is ridiculously bad. This was a ridiculously bad idea. Meanwhile, everywhere the English went and talked to the natives in hopes of finding that silver and gold, the natives started dying in huge numbers.
Because they're little smelly diseased people.
Yeah. Not only did they have all the guns and all the swords, they were killing everybody just by talking to them. Their popularity rating went way down really quickly. And to make it very short, pretty much everybody tried to surprise attack everybody at once. Mm-hmm. And the end result was that the English assassinated the leader of the Sikatans and were facing constant hostilities from the other indigenous people around them. And by that point, there was talk of like, we need to get on our boats and leave like immediately.
Well, yeah. I mean, seriously, if there was one house in my neighborhood that was causing nothing but problems and including getting people ill and dying, I'd like to think the HOA would get together.
Yeah.
and say, let's gang up on them.
Yeah. So by the spring of 1586, Sir Francis Drake shows up with fresh supplies, which he'd stolen from the Spanish. And
hey guys, I got chips.
And more people. And the soldiers in the colony are like, no, we want to get on your boat and leave. And Drake is like, no, it's going to be cool. I'm going to give you a fresh ship that you can use to leave anytime you want. And I'll give you 4 months of supplies. So for the next 4 months, you don't have to rely on anybody around you. And they all said, okay, that sounds pretty good. And as soon as he anchored the ship and got the supplies on the island, a storm swept up, blew the ship out to sea. So it was gone and destroyed the supplies. And, and at that point, even Drake was like, okay, y'all just get on the boat. We're going to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah. He said, enough is enough. He took all the remaining soldiers in the colony, minus 3 who were supposed to remain at the colony site with some supplies, and an unknown number of enslaved people and refugees that Drake had brought from Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and South America. He left them on the island at the colony to await the next supply ship. And then he sailed back to England. We don't know what happened to those people. They aren't in his records when he shows up in England, so clearly he left them. Mm-hmm. And literally days later, a supply ship sent by Sir Walter Raleigh showed up, and none of those people were there. That supply ship found the fort and colony completely abandoned, and they left. And just a couple of weeks after that, another supply convoy with another 400 soldiers showed up and found nothing. So when they started talking to the locals to find out what had happened, it's some indigenous people that they found and would talk to them, told them about the soldiers all getting on Francis Drake's ship and leaving, except for these 3. And they were like, we don't know what happened to them. So those people were actually kind of the first mystery.
Okay.
That supply ship left 15 soldiers and said, we're going to head back to England too.
15 people does not a colony make.
No. And
that's a camp out.
Yeah, they said, we're going to leave these 15 soldiers as a token presence where the colony is. And we're going to go back and report what's happened, and we'll figure out what's coming next. Those 15 soldiers, it turned out, were more or less immediately attacked by a coalition of indigenous peoples from the mainland.
Yeah, sure. There's 15 of them. Screw it.
Yeah.
What are they going to do?
Right. A couple of them were killed. The rest of them climbed in a small boat, and they tried to make for what was referred to as Port Ferdinando, which was an inlet where we now have Hatteras Island. Nobody ever saw them again. Nobody knows what happened to them, except they almost certainly did not make it there.
Huh.
That's the story of the first lost colony. And that was 1586. The second lost colony, and the one we refer to when we say the lost colony, Walter Raleigh decided to give it one more go, because his charter was going to run out in 1591. if you didn't have that permanent presence. And those whole episodes of like, we're going to leave 3 people and then we're going to leave 15 people and things like that. Those were all efforts for him to say, okay, I've got a permanent presence. There are people there.
All right.
He gives it another go. He raises a second effort using a totally different funding model, which is the colonists would have to buy shares in the colony or sign up as indentured servants. So he wouldn't have to raise a bunch of money from the court. He wouldn't have to ask Queen Elizabeth for a bunch of money, and he wouldn't have to fund it himself. And they took a totally different approach. They said, rather than a military outpost, let's just recruit normal people to go start a town. Let's have it include farmers and tailors and blacksmiths and whatever, and they can go be self-sufficient. And they don't have to deal with all this, like showing up and then nearly starving to death.
Like kickstart a town, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Let's kickstart a town. And so the idea was they would engage in trade and agriculture. And in the meantime, he could tell people those 15 soldiers are still there. So we're still good. My charter is still valid. He appointed this guy named John White, who was an artist. He was a watercolor artist. And also his specialty was that he painted what was called at the time miniatures, but I don't mean D&D miniatures. He painted like very small portraits of people.
Oh, tiny pictures.
He was obsessed with stories of the New World and had been there a couple of times on various other expeditions. And so he got hired to be the colony's governor, even though he had never been the manager of anything. He was told, recruit enough people, get enough subscriptions for your colony, and then make a go of it. The plan was for them to establish a new colony on the Chesapeake Bay, where Jamestown is now, basically where that would be established. They made it all the way around the Outer Banks, more or less without incident. And when they made it all the way around, they stopped at Roanoke to check on these 15 soldiers. And when they did, the pilot of the flagship, who was a guy named Fernandez, for whom Port Ferdinando had been named, because he was also the pilot on the first colonial expedition. He's the guy who ran the ship aground and got everybody's provisions destroyed. Once Wyatt and a bunch of colonists got in a smaller boat to go on to Roanoke, check in with those soldiers, Fernandez ordered the sailors to leave them there and said, we're not going to just check on these guys and then go to Chesapeake Bay. We're leaving them there and we're going back to England.
Why?
And Wyatt had no military component of his expedition. He was counting on there being 15 soldiers waiting there for him.
Right.
And so he doesn't have those 15 soldiers yet. And he also doesn't know that those 15 soldiers don't exist anymore.
Right.
And he has absolutely no choice but to say, okay, I guess we're going to establish our colony where the first colony was. And they all get dumped there.
Okay.
They go on land hoping that they'll find those 15 soldiers at least to help them out. And instead they find that the Fort Raleigh, which is now Fort Raleigh Historic Site, maybe. It's open to debate whether the part of the island where it all happened is even still above water. They go to that place looking for those soldiers. And what they find instead is that everything has been torn down except for the houses. Everything has been looted and taken. And melon vines have overgrown all the cottages in like the year since everybody left.
Oh, at least they got that going for them.
So he's like, okay, well, I guess let's tear down these melon vines and build these houses back up. And they just have to make a go of it on the spot.
Wow.
They found one bare skeleton and no sign of the soldiers.
Not a bear like, rawr, but like.
No, I mean like stripped to the bone skeleton. Okay. Like sun-bleached skeleton left on the ground.
Gotcha.
And that is the only sign of any human habitation other than the buildings. And the buildings are clearly abandoned. There are no supplies left. There are no tools, no nothing. There was a complete scientific workhouse there where they could do chemical experiments to test for the presence of precious metals. Well, that's gone. Like there is nothing there for these people. They also tried to reestablish contact with the local indigenous populations, not knowing about some of the stuff that had happened.
Right.
They talked to the Croatan on Croatoan Island, which is 50 miles to the south, whose first reaction was, upon seeing them, was to beg loudly that they not take their corn, which tells you the sort of reputation that the English had established for themselves in the region.
Right.
But then they recognized Manteo, the member of the Croatan tribe who had gone with them back to England when one of the first colony's ships had returned. He had gone to England, learned all about the English, learned a lot about the English government and about the way that their politics worked and what their interests were in the New World, and came back very ready to exploit that for his own purposes. And who can blame him? Once they recognized Manteo, they were like, okay, you're cool. You've brought somebody back that we know. The Croatan and the English colonists, White's colony, they established friendly relations. And that's how the English found out about the 15 soldiers being attacked and taking off on their boat and never being seen again. Relations with the other indigenous people were not so good. A colonist was immediately attacked and killed while he was crabbing by himself on the coast. Wyatt decided that he needed to retaliate against that. So he organized a nighttime raid on the village where he believed those attackers had come from. But the attackers had figured that there would probably be retaliation. And so they had abandoned that village. And when they got there, the people that they attacked in the village were actually other Croatans who had also heard about it and decided to come loot the village before the English could get there. So their only friends, they also killed some of immediately.
Oh.
Yeah. The Croatans said, this is really not great. And White said, this is really not great. And he decided to boost colonial morale by having a baptism ceremony for Manteo, in which he declared Manteo to be the Lord of Roanoke under Sir Walter Raleigh.
Okay.
And Manteo was like, okay, this is cool. This gets me in good with the English, and it gets me maybe some leverage with my own people to tell them that I'm in good with the English. So that's fine. And then 5 days after that, the birth of White's own granddaughter, Virginia Dare, happened. And this was seen as a really joyous occasion because, somebody who had been pregnant through a very unpleasant trip managed to make it there and have a baby. Another woman on the ship was also pregnant and had her own child like a week after that, but literally nobody bothered to write down the child's name.
And then there's the other one.
Yeah, pretty much. So pretty much immediately the colonists set about to establish a self-sustaining enterprise. They were planting, they were hunting, they were harvesting, they were trying to build up stores for winter, they were building new structures, they were setting up defenses, including a palisade, a fortified wall or fence around their village, which they dubbed the city of Raleigh. And White named a colonist to go back to England to collect more supplies, report on their success and the new location of the colony, and get more colonists. And he was going to stay and continue acting as the colony's governor, overseeing operations.
We're going to put a mural over there, and we're going to...
You say that as a joke, but he, an artist, brought a bunch of paintings that were framed in a trunk so that he could hang them on the walls of his home.
Sure. I mean, that's his thing.
Right. Why not? And he made countless watercolor maps and did illustrations of fauna and flora and all kinds of things. But the colonists got together and told him they wanted him to leave. They said, we really think it would be best if you went back to England.
Interesting.
And you handled everything there. And we'll stay here. We're good. And we'll see you when you get back.
Must have been a real piece of work.
Yeah. So he refused to go back, saying that he was worried people would think that he had intentionally abandoned the colony. And that it would be hard for him to recruit colonists in England if he showed up and said, yeah, I took everybody over there and then I left. Why don't you go with me? The colonists insisted anyway.
I wonder what his malfunction was.
To the crown saying that his return was, quote, necessary for the good and happy planting of us, and said, have a fun trip back with the guy who ordered you off the ship and onto Roanoke Island, because that guy was still the pilot of the flagship and was going to be the person leading them back to England. So he was mad at Fernandez and refused to go on the flagship, got on a different ship that ran into problems of its own. And instead of it taking a few weeks to get back to England, it took months, at which point they floated by accident into an Irish port with most of the crew dead of starvation.
Oh.
And by then, Spain was at war with England.
Ugh.
So England said, no ships leave, because every ship that is seaworthy has to join our fleet to fight the Spanish Armada. And that war had loomed when they left for the New World in the first place. In fact, it almost got canceled, the entire expedition, because of the threat of war with Spain. But Francis Drake had gone into a Spanish port, blown a bunch of stuff up, and slowed down the Spanish Armada's planned attack on England and bought them enough time to leave. Well, now they were at war. Nobody was going anywhere. And White spent the next 3 years trying to find his way back to the Outer Banks, including an expedition that he got approval to take that then immediately ran into problems and had to turn around and come back home. He hired a privateer, a licensed pirate, who ran into problems, got in a big battle with the Spanish, and White himself was badly injured and had to return to England to recover. For years, he ran into one problem after another trying to get back to the colonies. And the whole time he was telling everybody, when I left, we had a rule we had agreed upon that if there were any sort of reason why they had to go elsewhere, they would carve the name of the place where they went into a tree trunk, knowing that the Spanish might not know what place that referred to and might not think to check tree trunks in the woods around the village. So that was one thing that they had agreed on. And the other thing they had agreed on was if you have to leave in a crisis situation, carve a cross with the name of wherever you're going so that I will know that it was under duress.
Interesting. Okay.
And then he told everybody. But when I left, they had told me that they had a new plan, and that was that they were going to go 50 miles inland. They were going to go 50 miles further up into the Main presently. They were not going to stick around on Roanoke Island. He left knowing that that was the case.
Okay. That's news to me.
They had all agreed that they would leave him these messages if they did actually go somewhere else. Once he finally gets back to the Outer Banks after 3 years, he's gotten a convoy of 2 ships. They're not really ships that are there to go to the Outer Banks. They're ships that were going to the Caribbean to do privateering, and he booked passage on one of them on the agreement that they would stop at the Outer Banks on their way back.
Okay.
Part of the reason why the Outer Banks was ever appealing to the English in the first place is that in that big route that I described where the Spanish went, it would come up the coast of what's now the southeastern United States, and they would turn east at the Outer Banks because that's where they could pick up the Gulf Stream to cross the Atlantic more easily, quickly. And that meant that the Outer Banks was basically the last place in North America where anybody could see a ship or what happened to it. And the English were very interested in establishing a presence there because they wanted to establish a privateering base to attack Spanish ships on their way past when it was too late for Spain to do any turning back and getting help.
That makes sense.
Yeah. These privateers said, sure, we'll stop there on our way back because we have
It's interesting that it was that he had to wait for the way back. So he's got to go on all these adventures before he gets to where he wants to go.
Oh, yeah. Because like that's the way the currents flowed.
Right.
There was no sail directly to the Outer Banks. There was just, you got to go through the Caribbean and up.
Right.
So they stop outside the Outer Banks, not in the Sound, but outside the Outer Banks. And this is in 1590. So 3 years later, almost to the day since he left. And as soon as they arrived, they spotted a plume of smoke coming from Roanoke Island, the other side of the barrier islands from where the colony had been established. The next morning, the ship fired its cannon 3 times to signal that they were going to approach. And then White and the captain of one of the ships, plus a bunch of the crew, rowed through an inlet to begin approaching Roanoke Island. As they did so, and after the cannons fired, a second plume of smoke rose from Hatteras Island to the south of Roanoke Island. What's now Hatteras, but at the time was Croatoan. What's now Hatteras Island at the time was 2 islands. It was Hatteras Island and Croatoan. And there was an inlet between them. And the inlet filled in the late 1600s and formed what's now Hatteras Island.
Okay.
So they fire these cannons while they're headed for where they've seen smoke on Roanoke Island. And a new smoke plume comes up from Croatoan. And they're like, okay, well, that must be where they are. And they turn the boats and head that direction. They land on Hatteras, what's now Hatteras, thinking they were close to the source of the smoke, but it was hard to gauge distance. And they ended up having to walk miles through the forest with no provisions, no path, no water, no nothing to get to where the smoke was coming from. And when they get there, there's no people, there's no village, there's no colony, there's no nothing. So they turn around and they hike all the way back where their boats are, desperately thirsty and starving. White teaches everybody a trick he had learned on previous expeditions where you dig a hole in the beach and you get to some fresh water. And everybody had a little drink and they got back in their boats and they rowed back to the ships. The next day, they rowed back. They're planning to try again. And the rowboats that they were using to get from their ships to the Sound side got swamped by rough seas. A bunch of sailors and one of the captains and his mate from one of the 2 ships in the convoy drowned just trying to avoid being washed out to sea by the rough waters.
Ugh.
And the rest of them spent literally all day just trying to survive.
Do you remember when I said that it feels like a place that people aren't supposed to be?
Yeah. And they spent all day trying to rescue sailors and failing to do so. So at the end of the day, they have to row back to the ships to reprovision their rowboats because they've used all their provisions, surviving while they try to save all the people who are drowning.
Oh my gosh.
But they get back to the ship at night, and White insists that they make for Roanoke, even though the sun was setting. And the remaining captain ordered his sailors to take White there, despite them having just watched a bunch of their shipmates die in front of them. And they head back to Roanoke Island on the theory that maybe that smoke that they first saw really is where the colonists are. In the dark, they miss the landing White was looking for. They overshoot the colony site. And then when they turn around, they see the light of a great fire through the woods.
Oh.
So they pull up to the coast, but they stop just offshore because the sailors are worried that this doesn't indicate good things are happening. And White orders the sailors to play a trumpet and sing English songs in hopes that the colonists will hear it, realize that the ships have returned, and come out to greet them.
English songs, like the Beatles.
Yeah. Nobody comes to greet them. They end up anchoring these rowboats offshore, and they sleep the night in these rowboats, hoping that English colonists will appear on the shore to holler at them. And in the morning, when they go ashore, what they find are footprints in the sand on a bluff overlooking where the boats were anchored. So people came and looked at them while they were sleeping and did not hail them.
Interesting.
Then they go ashore. They find where the village was. They find CRO carved into a tree trunk, and they find Croatoan carved into one of the posts of the palisade. They don't find a cross carved into anything, but all the goods are taken. White had buried these trunks of stuff, these trunks of art, things like that, and said, I'm going to bury all this so that it's here for me when I come back. All that was gone. Everything was taken. The entire place had been emptied, but nothing had been torn down.
Very intentional.
Yeah, nothing had been burned. Nothing had been damaged. There were no graves. There were no bodies. No nothing.
And that's it.
There's no cross carved into either message.
Right.
The houses have been dismantled and removed. All the trade goods were taken. Croatoan, however, was an island 50 miles south, not inland. White says, we're going to go back to the ships back outside the Outer Banks. And tomorrow we'll take the ships south to Croatoan, and that's where we'll find the colonists. Instead, overnight, another storm blew in, snapped one of the two remaining anchor cables, and nearly wrecked the ship. And at that point, the captain said, we're out of here. I'm sorry. We're not going to go back in the morning. The storm is not abating. We're going to sail back to the Caribbean. We'll spend the winter there. We'll come back next spring. You can start looking for them again. They leave, and instead of sailing back to the Caribbean, the storm blows them off course, and they wind up in the Azores with no supplies, no time to get back to the Caribbean, and they have to sail back to England. And that was the last time that White had any opportunity to try to find the lost colony.
That is wild. There's a lot of details in there I didn't know.
Raleigh refused to fund any real subsequent search and rescue efforts. He funded one in 1603. The people on that expedition were killed the second they got there. Everybody kind of said, well, we don't know what happened. White ended up retiring penniless to Ireland and didn't really have a public life after that, to the point that we don't even know when he died or where he's buried. But some of his papers turned up in an Irish estate in the middle of the 19th century.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it kind of stayed a mystery after that. But it also was just kind of seen as another failed colony. All right. That is the first part of this 2-part episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards. Croatan on Croatoan, or the Croatoan people on, wait a minute, now I've gotten myself confused.